London, May 8, 1945. Crowds screamed, church bells rang, flags rippled through the smoke of a ruined empire. Britain had won. But beneath the cheering, something irreversible had already been signed. The country that claimed victory had quietly sold the keys to its own independence. What no one in the crowd could see was that Britain's greatest defeat didn't come from Berlin or Tokyo. It came from Washington. And it didn't arrive with bombs or battleships. It came wrapped in a contract called Lend-Lease. Officially, it was aid. In practice, it was extraction. On paper, it was a lifeline. In reality, it was the bill that ended the British Empire. Here's the paradox. Britain fought for survival and survived only by surrendering control. It was the only way to keep fighting. But every bullet fired, every ship repaired, every can of fuel delivered from America came with a clause that turned a war for freedom into a mortgage on sovereignty. In 1940, when the Royal Navy was running out of destroyers, Roosevelt's offer sounded generous. "We'll lend you what you need. Pay later." But it wasn't lending in any normal sense. The U.S. didn't hand over assets, it leased them, with the right to recall, replace, or charge for every component. The British didn't own the weapons that saved them. They were renting survival. And here's the hidden mechanism. For every ton of supplies Britain received, it had to liquidate something: gold reserves, overseas assets, or trade privileges. Visible event: the arrival of American tanks in North Africa. Hidden mechanism: the quiet transfer of British gold from South Africa and Canada to New York vaults. Irreversible consequence: by 1942, Britain had sold or pledged nearly all its dollar reserves. This wasn't an alliance of equals. It was a bailout with a stopwatch. Every deal was temporary, but the dependency it created wasn't. Lend-Lease shipments could be halted at any moment. And in 1945, that's exactly what happened. Within days of victory, Washington terminated the program. No transition, no warning. 1 week, Britain was fighting alongside America. The next, it was begging for a loan to buy the same goods it had been receiving for free just days earlier. This wasn't negligence, it was leverage. By cutting off supplies overnight, the U.S. forced Britain to the table, desperate, indebted, and defenseless. The price of restarting the flow? The Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946. $3.75 billion at 2% interest, tied to conditions that dismantled imperial trade protections and opened the empire's markets to American goods. That clause, Article 9, looked harmless: non-discrimination in commerce. But it was a dagger aimed at the heart of Britain's economic power, the sterling area, the system that bound the empire together through preferential trade. Within a decade, that system collapsed. The empire's financial arteries were cut open, and the pound, once the currency of global trade, was reduced to a regional token. They called it mutual aid, but mutual aid doesn't end empires. Extraction does. By 1945, Britain had sent more than £1.3 billion in assets abroad to pay for American goods it didn't even own. Factories were dismantled, patents shared, markets opened, all under the banner of cooperation. And yet, the debt lingered until 2006. 60 years later, the free weapons of democracy were still being paid for. This didn't happen by accident. It was built into the design. The U.S. didn't just win the war, it bought the peace. It inherited global supremacy not through conquest, but through credit. Britain celebrated victory, but its empire was already collateral. And that was only the visible part of the deal. By the spring of 1941, the illusion of control was already cracking. Britain was still officially the senior partner in the war effort, but its balance sheets told a different story. The gold reserves were bleeding out, the dollar accounts in New York nearly empty. Every convoy to Britain carried not just supplies, but a price tag. The empire was at war. The empire was also up for sale. Visible event? Winston Churchill standing before Parliament declaring Britain would never surrender. Hidden mechanism? Behind that same speech, the Treasury was wiring what was left of the nation's financial sovereignty to Washington and Ottawa. Irreversible consequence. By 1941, Britain's overseas investments, built over centuries, were being dismantled piece by piece, converted into cash to buy American guns. This wasn't aid. It was liquidation disguised as assistance. Here's how it worked. The U.S. set up the Lend-Lease administration in March 1941, promising to supply its allies without payment in kind. But the fine print was brutal. Everything lent could be recalled, replaced, or charged for later. And anything still usable after the war had to be paid for or returned, even if it had been destroyed in combat. Imagine renting oxygen during a fire. That was Britain's position. Churchill called it the most unsorted act in history. But the math said otherwise. Between 1939 and 1945, Britain sent nearly $12 billion in assets abroad: gold, securities, entire corporate holdings. The Bank of England's reserves in New York were stripped to almost nothing. The Canadian gold vaults at Fort Churchill emptied into American hands. Every shipment of tanks meant another sale of colonial stock. Every cargo of food meant another piece of the empire mortgaged. This wasn't just economic strain, it was structural dependency. And the U.S. knew it. Roosevelt's advisors, Harry Dexter White, Henry Morgenthau, understood that Britain's weakness was an opportunity to rewrite global finance. Their logic was cold, precise, and utterly legal. If Britain needed dollars, it would have to dismantle its empire's financial walls. No preference for the colonies. No closed sterling zones. Free trade meant American trade. The weapon wasn't an army, it was convertibility. When the pound was finally forced into convertibility under the 1946 loan terms, the results were immediate and devastating. The sterling area's reserves evaporated in weeks. By August 1947, Britain had to suspend convertibility, too late to undo the damage. The empire's economic heart had been cracked open. And here's the paradox no one dared to say aloud. The country that had fought to liberate others had signed away its own autonomy, line by line, in the language of financial obligation. The British public saw American ships unloading crates marked "From the United States." They didn't see the legal documents that made those crates into collateral. They didn't see the colonial assets transferred, or the way Washington quietly mapped every British dependency's output, from Malayan rubber to Indian jute, to calculate future American access. This wasn't alliance, this was auditing with a flag attached. By 1943, the British Empire had become what economists now call a dependent service economy, exporting goods, importing credit. The richest empire on earth was surviving on borrowed oil and conditional goodwill. There was no single betrayal, no midnight coup. Just contracts, signatures, and a slow erosion of leverage. An empire that once dictated trade terms now begged for extensions, and every clause was permanent. They said it was temporary war finance, but it rewired the global system forever. Sterling would never again be the world's reserve, and Britain would never again act without asking what Washington might think. It wasn't defeat by invasion, it was defeat by invoice. And the bill hadn't even been fully presented yet. That came next, when Britain tried to reclaim its freedom and found it had already been priced out. If you're still watching, remember this. Empires rarely fall. They're refinanced to death. In August 1945, the guns went silent, but the silence wasn't peace, it was foreclosure. Britain had survived the war, but now it had to survive the peace. And peace came with interest. The numbers were merciless. By the end of the war, Britain owed the United States over $30 billion in today's money. The Lend-Lease pipeline, once a torrent of supplies, was cut off overnight on September 2, 1945, the day after Japan's surrender. No warning, no transition. Factories in Birmingham, Glasgow, and Belfast were still producing for the front when the telegram arrived. All Lend-Lease terminated. Visible event, victory parades and Churchill's speeches about rebuilding. Hidden mechanism, a total collapse of imports, fuel, food, machinery, within weeks. Irreversible consequence, Britain was bankrupt before the victory posters even came down. Imagine fighting for 6 years only to wake up and find your credit card canceled the moment you win. That's what happened. The British economy, starved by war and stripped of reserves, couldn't function without American shipments. The choice was brutal. Either negotiate a massive loan on American terms or face starvation and social collapse. The empire that had once dictated the world's trade routes was now negotiating for bread. So in late 1945, a British delegation headed by John Maynard Keynes, yes, the same Keynes who had written the general theory, boarded a ship to Washington. His mission? Secure a loan to keep the country alive. He wasn't sent to negotiate victory terms. He was sent to beg for oxygen. The meetings were brutal. American negotiators, led by Treasury Secretary Fred Vinson and Harry Dexter White, didn't talk like allies. They talked like creditors. Every British proposal for leniency was met with one word: conditions. Condition 1, full repayment at 2% interest. Condition 2, immediate dismantling of imperial preference, the system that allowed Britain to trade within its empire at favorable rates. Condition 3, convertibility of the pound into dollars. To the public, this sounded like cooperation. In practice, it was surrender. Keynes, already frail and ill, described it privately as a financial Dunkirk. He signed the deal in December 1945. He died 4 months later. The loan, $3.75 billion, the largest in history at that time, wasn't just a financial instrument. It was a blueprint for a new world order. Britain's empire had been structured on control of trade routes, currency blocks, and colonial surpluses. The U.S. loan required tearing that down. This wasn't economics. It was empire management through debt. And the logic was chillingly clear. If Britain could no longer enforce global trade under the pound, the U.S. dollar would step in. Lend-Lease had been the opening move. The 1946 loan was the checkmate. Every British possession now had to realign its trade toward the dollar system. Malaya's rubber, India's tea, Egypt's cotton, all reoriented through American banks. The empire was still there on the map, but financially, it was already American real estate. The public never saw the transfer. There was no flag lowered, no ceremony, just interest payments. Endless, silent, automatic. Britain made the last repayment in 2006, 60 years after the war. 2 generations had lived and died paying for a gift. This is what victory looked like. Rationing that lasted until 1954, food imports controlled by Washington, the empire dismantled piece by piece to pay an invoice written in 1941. It wasn't theft, it was architecture. A perfectly legal reprogramming of global power. Lend-Lease didn't just save Britain. It saved it in a way that made independence impossible. And yet, in the post-war propaganda, this system had a new name: the special relationship. But relationships built on debt aren't partnerships. They're dependencies with better lighting. That's the quiet genius of the deal. It didn't just end the British Empire, it made the end look voluntary. And this was only the beginning of America's next experiment, turning empire into a franchise model. What they tested on Britain, they would later apply to the entire post-war world. Then it was called Lend-Lease. Today, it's called foreign aid. If this made you question who really won 1945, share this with someone who still thinks empires end with flags, not ledgers. The ink was barely dry on the 1946 Anglo-American loan agreement when the second phase of the operation began: conversion. Not just of currency, but of power itself. Britain thought it had bought time. In reality, it had sold autonomy. The loan came with a fuse hidden in the fine print: the convertibility clause. Once activated, every pound in the sterling area could be exchanged for US dollars. To ordinary people, that sounded harmless, technical, even fair. In practice, it meant that the colonies, dominions, and foreign holders of sterling could drain Britain's dollar reserves overnight. And they did. Visible event. Newspapers in July 1947 announcing convertibility of sterling begins. Hidden mechanism. A financial run engineered by arithmetic, not armies. Irreversible consequence. In just 5 weeks, Britain lost nearly half of its remaining dollar reserves. It was the cleanest extraction in modern history. No coups, no invasions, just contracts doing their quiet work. Within days, the Treasury panicked. Imports froze, payments stalled, inflation soared. On August 20th, 1947, the British government suspended convertibility. Too late. The experiment had achieved its purpose. The pound was broken as a world currency, and the dollar had stepped into its place. The empire's arteries, the sterling area that once funneled wealth back to London, were now reconnected to Washington. What Britain had spent 3 centuries building through conquest was reprogrammed through credit in less than 3 years. This wasn't an accident of post-war exhaustion. It was a deliberate shift in world architecture. The Americans called it economic stabilization. But it stabilized only one thing, the dollar's dominance. And here's where the moral paradox sharpened to a knife's edge. Britain had entered the war to destroy fascism. It had sacrificed millions to defend freedom. But in order to survive that fight, it had surrendered the financial sovereignty that underpinned its global reach. Victory demanded submission. Freedom demanded debt. Security demanded obedience. These weren't choices between good and bad, they were choices between oxygen and suffocation. By the late 1940s, the transformation was visible everywhere. British companies, once imperial giants, were being forced to sell assets to meet dollar obligations. Rolls-Royce, Imperial Tobacco, British Petroleum, all restructured to accommodate American shareholders and markets. London, once the clearinghouse of global finance, was now a junior partner in a system whose levers sat in New York. And yet the propaganda of partnership kept the illusion alive. The phrase special relationship began circulating in speeches, press releases, and films. It sounded noble, cooperative, equal. But it was built on structural dependency, Britain's need for American credit and America's need for Britain's legitimacy. The optics were perfect. The United States could present itself as the generous savior, rebuilding Europe under the Marshall Plan, while the former empire quietly played the role of intermediary, prestige without power. It was the softest coup in history. Lend-Lease had been the prototype. The 1946 loan was the execution. The Marshall Plan was the global rollout. By 1950, every major European economy was tied to the dollar. Britain's empire had dissolved into Commonwealth, and the pound, the proud symbol of imperial finance, was reduced to a managed currency, its value determined not by empire, but by American policy. The language changed, but the structure didn't. Then it was called convertibility. Now it's called market liberalization. The principle remains the same, dependency rebranded as progress. Britain didn't lose its empire in a battle. It signed it away in a loan agreement. No gunfire, no surrender ceremony, just signatures, clauses, and deadlines. And that's why the story feels invisible, because it was designed to. The empire didn't collapse, it was quietly absorbed. If you're still watching, remember this. Power doesn't always conquer. Sometimes it invoices. And the next invoice was already being written in Washington in 1948 under a new name that would define the next century, the Marshall Plan. Tell me in the comments, when did your country sign its sovereignty away? By 1948, Britain was exhausted. Bombed cities still in rubble, rationing worse than during the war, and a treasury drowning in debt. The victory empire couldn't feed itself. And that's when Washington unveiled its next masterpiece, the Marshall Plan. It was sold as salvation, European recovery they called it. But the real recovery wasn't Europe's. It was America's investment portfolio. Visible event, General George Marshall's speech at Harvard promising billions to rebuild Europe. Hidden mechanism, every dollar of that aid had to be spent on American goods, shipped on American vessels, under contracts written in Washington. Irreversible consequence. Western Europe, and especially Britain, was locked into a permanent economic orbit around the dollar. The genius was psychological. The word aid disarms suspicion. It sounded benevolent, moral, even heroic. But the fine print turned generosity into a supply chain. 80% of Marshall funds flowed straight back to the U.S. through exports of machinery, grain, oil, and manufactured goods. Europe was rebuilt, but rebuilt as a customer, not a competitor. And Britain? Britain became the middleman of its own decline. The once mighty imperial trader was now a broker for American finance, distributing dollars, enforcing convertibility, stabilizing markets it no longer controlled. The City of London transformed into what it remains today, an offshore dollar hub, a semi-detached outpost of the American financial empire. Churchill had promised to keep Britain at the heart of a united Europe. What he didn't say was that the heart was American-owned. The Marshall Plan wasn't just money, it was a political operating system. Participating nations had to open their markets, coordinate under U.S.-approved committees, and accept the supervision of American economic advisors embedded in their ministries. Sovereignty didn't vanish, it was outsourced. Britain tried to play both sides, keep its empire's trade preferences and take the dollars, but the arithmetic was merciless. The Marshall Rules forbade discrimination in trade. The empire's protected markets, from Indian cotton to West African cocoa, were declared incompatible with the new order. So London complied. It dismantled its own global trading system, one clause at a time, to qualify for a program advertised as Reconstruction. This wasn't charity, this was foreclosure disguised as friendship. And the optics were flawless. American diplomats arrived in European capitals like heroes, distributing funds while drafting constitutions. Hollywood filmed the rubble. Coca-Cola followed the tanks. Europe was saved, but it was saved into permanent subordination. The war had destroyed cities. The Marshall Plan rebuilt dependency. In Britain, rationing continued until 1954. The colonies revolted, one after another. India, Burma, Palestine, Malaya, each peeled away as the treasury's debts grew. The cost of freedom was empire, and Washington didn't need to conquer any of it. It simply redirected the flows of capital. The numbers were undeniable. By 1950, U.S. industrial output equaled that of the rest of the world combined. The dollar accounted for nearly 90% of international reserves. The pound sterling, once the axis of global trade, was now just another satellite currency. And yet, British politicians still spoke of partnership, unity, shared ideals. The language of empire had been replaced by the language of dependence, aid, cooperation, recovery. The vocabulary changed, the leverage didn't. Because the Marshall Plan wasn't a gift, it was a franchise model. The United States exported not just dollars, but its economic DNA, consumption, debt, privatization, and control through credit. This is how you replace an empire without firing a shot. You lend, you lease, you assist, until the client can't breathe without your currency. Lend-Lease was the prototype. The Marshall Plan was the system at scale. And the irony is almost perfect. Britain had entered the war to prevent one empire from dominating Europe. It ended by helping another build one that would last a century. That was the real victory of 1945, not on the battlefield, but in the balance sheets. The empire didn't fall, it was franchised. And the next move in that franchise would export the same blueprint far beyond Europe, to the developing world, where aid would become the new weapon of control. If you're still watching, remember this line. Every empire claims to bring order. The new ones do it through loans. Now ask yourself, when the Marshall Plan ended, what replaced it? You already know the name, the World Bank, the IMF. That's where this story goes next. By 1950, Britain's empire had new landlords. The maps hadn't changed yet, but the money had. The old imperial offices were still there. Colonial governors, trade boards, naval outposts. But the real authority had shifted across the Atlantic into two marble buildings in Washington, D.C. They had new names, polite names, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They were sold as neutral institutions, scientific, rational, benevolent. But behind the white columns and the mathematical jargon, they were the continuation of Lend-Lease by other means. Visible event? Post-war conferences filled with diplomats, economists, and promises of global cooperation. Hidden mechanism. Voting shares tied to financial contributions, meaning the United States held permanent veto power. Irreversible consequence. The rest of the world was invited to borrow, but never to lead. The blueprint was the same one tested on Britain. Lend in the name of stability, bind with debt, demand reform. This time, the experiment scaled globally. Britain had once ruled through gunboats and tariffs. Now, Washington ruled through credit and conditionality. And the irony? Britain helped build the system that erased its own power. John Maynard Keynes, the same man who negotiated Britain's 1946 loan, had tried to propose an alternative, a neutral world currency called the Bancor, backed by an international clearing union. It would have limited the dominance of any one nation's money, but the Americans rejected it outright. They insisted the dollar was the world's currency, and the rest of the world agreed because they had no choice. The same pattern repeated: visible rescue, hidden subordination. The IMF would stabilize economies. The World Bank would develop them. In reality, both would enforce a global architecture where sovereignty was conditional, measured by credit ratings, not constitutions. Britain understood the system intimately because it had lived through the prototype. Every post-war devaluation of the pound, every crisis in sterling convertibility was a reminder that it was now just another client in a dollar world. And as Britain tried to hold on to fragments of its empire, those fragments were being refashioned into debt colonies. Ghana, Nigeria, Malaya, Ceylon, the new independent nations emerged into a financial trap already set. Loans for infrastructure, loans for modernization, each one denominated in dollars, each one underwritten by Washington's approval. This wasn't conquest, it was continuity. The World Bank was the empire's new colonial office, except its memos came with interest rates instead of flags. And here's the hidden elegance. The old empires needed soldiers to maintain control. The new one needed accountants. The IMF didn't need to send troops. A letter was enough. A recommendation to devalue a currency, privatize an industry, or slash public spending. The result was always the same. Wealth flowed upward, resources flowed outward. Nations stayed sovereign on paper, but in practice their budgets were written elsewhere. Britain, stripped of empire but desperate for influence, didn't resist this system. It joined it. The City of London reinvented itself as the dollar's offshore engine, laundering American credit through colonial networks it once ruled directly. The old imperial arteries were reopened, not to serve London, but to feed Wall Street. And that's the moral twist too few saw coming. Britain lost its empire, but became a subcontractor for the next one. The empire of territory became an empire of liquidity. The red lines on the map were replaced by balance sheets. This was the final transformation of Lend-Lease, from a wartime contract to a world order, a system so total that even its victims defend it as progress. Officially, it's about stability. In practice, it's about control. And the control works best when nobody calls it empire anymore. By the time Britain paid its last Lend-Lease installment in 2006, the pattern had already repeated 100 times across the global south. Different faces, different currencies, same logic. The empire never died. It just learned compound interest. And the last lesson Britain learned was the most bitter of all. You can't pay back a debt that was designed to keep you paying forever. That's how extraction becomes invisible. That's how power hides behind policy. If you're still watching, remember this. The next time you hear the word aid, ask, aid for whom? Because the world that replaced the British Empire didn't abolish exploitation, it optimized it. And the final act of this story, the one nobody wants to tell, is how Britain tried to reclaim independence in the 1950s and 60s, and discovered that even its rebellion had already been priced in. By the mid-1950s, Britain was desperate to believe it still mattered. The Union Jack still flew in Africa, in the Caribbean, across the Indian Ocean. The Queen was crowned. The parades looked imperial again. But under the golden ceremony, the empire was running on overdraft. Visible event? The coronation of 1953. Pageantry, trumpets, a global audience. Hidden mechanism, a bankrupt state kept alive by dollar loans and a credit line from the IMF. Irreversible consequence, every display of strength was financed by someone else's permission. That tension exploded in 1956, Suez, the last time Britain tried to act like an empire, and the moment it discovered it wasn't one. When Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, London saw it as theft. The canal was the empire's artery, built with British capital, guarded by British troops. So Eden, the prime minister, decided to take it back by force. France joined. Israel joined. The operation was swift, militarily precise. And then came the phone call from Washington. President Eisenhower's message was simple: stop, or we dump the pound. Because behind the scenes, the U.S. Treasury had already begun selling sterling. The British reserves, fragile, over-leveraged, dependent on American credit, started to collapse. Within days, London was facing a currency run. Eden didn't surrender to Nasser. He surrendered to arithmetic. This was the real battlefield of the post-war world. Not tanks, but exchange rates. Not invasion, but liquidation. Suez was the moment Britain realized it couldn't move without Washington's approval. The last illusion of independence died that week. The empire had ended in a spreadsheet. And yet the headlines called it a diplomatic crisis. They still didn't understand. It wasn't diplomacy. It was debt enforcement. After Suez, Britain stopped pretending. The imperial project was rebranded as the Commonwealth. Decolonization followed, not out of moral awakening, but fiscal necessity. Each flag lowered wasn't a tragedy, it was a payment. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Malaya, all granted independence under the same conditions. Adopt the dollar system, peg your currency, borrow from the World Bank, and keep trade open. Officially, they were free. In practice, they had inherited Britain's debt position, just further down the chain. The empire hadn't vanished, it had gone corporate. The City of London adapted faster than anyone. It reinvented itself as the financial laundromat of the new order. Offshore trusts, dollar clearing, euro-dollar markets. By the 1960s, British banks were quietly recycling American capital back into the world, earning commissions on the very system that had bankrupted them. They called it innovation. But it was the same logic that began with Lend-Lease: rent survival, sell autonomy. Here's the brutal symmetry. The empire that once extracted through colonies now extracted through markets. The nation that had been a debtor turned itself into a broker for global debt. That's how dependency becomes ideology. When Harold Macmillan declared in 1960 that the wind of change is blowing through this continent, he wasn't announcing liberation. He was announcing outsourcing. And yet, the myth of the special relationship remained intact because it was emotionally priceless. Britain could no longer dominate, but it could narrate. It could still pretend to be the wise elder of an empire now headquartered in Washington. This is how decline disguises itself, not with defeat, but with ceremony. The crown stayed, the money moved. By the time the Beatles sang about revolution, the real one had already happened, quietly in 1941, when Britain mortgaged its future for borrowed bullets. Everything after was accounting. That's the hidden arc of Lend-Lease, a rescue that became dependence, a partnership that became hierarchy, a victory that ended in foreclosure. And today, the model still runs. Now it's development loans, stabilization funds, reconstruction programs. The names change, the leverage doesn't. Empires don't vanish, they just switch languages, from Latin to English, from gunfire to interest rates. Britain didn't lose its empire. It taught the next one how to bill for it. If this made you see aid and alliance differently, share it. Because the story of Lend-Lease isn't about the past. It's about how power still works, quietly, mathematically, and always in someone else's favor.